February 21st, 1945, 14:20 hours, somewhere near Motoyama Airfield No. 1, Iwo Jima. Staff Sergeant Robert Meza crouches inside 35 tons of steel, sweat already pooling in his boots despite the chill that grips the volcanic island. Through the narrow vision slit of his modified Sherman tank, he watches Marines pinned against black sand, their bodies flattened behind whatever cover the lifeless terrain offers. Machine gun fire stitches the air in bursts so precise they seem mechanical, which in a way they are, the product of Japanese gunners operating from positions that have withstood 3 days of naval bombardment and relentless airstrikes. The Marines are not advancing, they are dying. Meza glances at the pressure gauge mounted near his right knee, the needle steady at 300 pounds per square inch, and he knows that what happens in the next 5 minutes will either validate months of secret preparation or condemn his crew to become another footnote in a battle that is already consuming lives at a rate that terrifies even the generals. He does not yet know that his tank, number 431, painted in standard marine green with no markings to distinguish it from the dozens of other Shermans scattered across this nightmare island, carries inside its hull a weapon that Japanese intelligence has dismissed as American propaganda, a weapon whose existence has been so closely guarded that even most Marines have never seen it, a weapon that will, in the assessment of a Marine captain who will survive this battle, prove to be the single most important factor in breaking the Japanese defense of Iwo Jima. The tank lurches forward, and Meza feels the familiar shudder of the right radial engine straining against volcanic ash that has the consistency of talcum powder in some places and crude concrete in others. Private James Morrison, hunched in the driver's position to Meza's left, fights the controls as the Sherman's tracks churn through terrain that seems designed by some malevolent engineer to frustrate mechanized warfare. Behind them, 4 other Shermans follow, standard gun tanks, whose crews have been briefed to provide covering fire, though for what they do not entirely understand. The Marine infantry has been told to stay back, to wait, an order that contradicts every instinct they have developed through campaigns on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian. They watch Meza's tank with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. These men who have learned through bitter experience that tanks on Pacific islands are useful until they are not, mobile until the terrain defeats them, armored until a well-placed Japanese gun reduces them to burning coffins. 125 yards from the nearest pillbox, Meza gives the order. Corporal Thomas Carlson, the gunner, peers through his periscope at a structure that looks like nothing more than a low mound of earth and rock, except for the narrow slit from which a Japanese machine gun has been firing with methodical precision for the past hour. Carlson's hand moves to a control that in a standard Sherman would traverse the turret to aim the 75mm main gun. But Tank 431 is not a standard Sherman. In place of the main gun's recoil mechanism, hidden behind the barrel that from the outside looks identical to every other Sherman's primary armament, sits a flame projector, a device that has been engineered, tested, modified, and re-engineered over the past 18 months by a composite team of Navy Seabees, chemical warfare service personnel, and Marine Corps technicians working in workshops on Oahu that operated under security protocols usually reserved for atomic research. The first burst lasts 15 seconds. From the muzzle of what appears to be a 75mm gun erupts not a shell, but a stream of liquid fire, napalm-thickened fuel that has been pressurized by nitrogen bottles and ignited by a magnesium-phosphorus ignition system that activates at the moment of discharge. The stream arcs across the volcanic wasteland in a trajectory that seems almost lazy compared to the violent speed of artillery. But what it lacks in velocity, it compensates for in horror. The flame, burning at temperatures that exceed 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, does not simply strike the pillbox and dissipate. It pours through the firing slit like malevolent water, flowing into the interior space where Japanese soldiers have sheltered behind walls of reinforced concrete that can withstand direct hits from naval guns. The Marines, watching from their positions in the ash, see smoke begin to pour from vents they had not known existed, They hear sounds that will stay with them for the rest of their lives, sounds that some will refuse to describe even decades later when historians ask them to recount their experiences. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun opens fire from a position 200 yards to the north. The shell, capable of penetrating the side armour of a Sherman at close range, strikes Tank 431's frontal glacis plate at an angle and ricochets into the sky with a sound like a massive bell being struck. Mesa's tank does not stop. It does not even slow. Carlson traverses the turret, and another burst of flame lances out toward a second pillbox, this one partially concealed behind the wreckage of a Japanese fighter plane that was destroyed days ago in American bombing raids. The flame finds the ventilation shaft, a 4-inch opening that the Japanese engineers cut into the reinforced structure to prevent carbon monoxide buildup from the weapons being fired inside. Through this opening, designed to preserve life, pours fire that consumes everything organic it touches. The machine gun that has been firing from this position goes silent. It will never fire again. By sunset, on that first day of employment, all 8 of the specially modified Sherman flame tanks brought to Iwo Jima have been committed to action. The Marines who witnessed their effectiveness begin to spread the word through the rifle companies dug into the volcanic ash. "Wait for the Zippos," they tell each other, using the nickname that has emerged spontaneously, a reference to the cigarette lighter, whose advertising slogan promises that it lights every time. The name will stick, and it will spread, until years later, in a different war fought in Vietnamese jungles, soldiers will still refer to flame tanks as Zippos, long after most have forgotten the battle that gave birth to the name. But on that February evening in 1945, with the sun setting over an island that measures only 8 square miles, but contains within that small space a concentration of fortifications unlike anything American forces have yet encountered in the Pacific War, the full impact of what has just occurred has not yet registered. Tank 431 has expended 200 gallons of fuel mixture, roughly 20% of its total capacity. 6 pillboxes have been destroyed or neutralized. Marine infantry has advanced 600 yards, a distance that before the arrival of the flame tanks had cost 140 casualties over 2 days of fighting. The mathematics are brutal but simple, the kind of arithmetic that generals calculate in field headquarters while staff officers maintain carefully neutral expressions, the calculus of war that weighs lives against objectives and finds the exchange acceptable when the ratio favors the advancing force. To understand how American forces came to possess a weapon that would prove so decisive on Iwo Jima, it is necessary to travel backward in time 18 months to a vacant field at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, where in August of 1943 a group of men are attempting to solve a problem that has haunted American commanders since the campaign in the Solomon Islands began more than a year earlier. The problem is straightforward in its essentials, but devilishly complex in its execution. Japanese defensive tactics in the Pacific have evolved from the early war doctrine of meeting American landings at the water's edge, a strategy that proved catastrophic when confronted with overwhelming American material superiority and naval gunfire support. By 1943, Japanese commanders have developed a new approach, one that accepts the inevitability of American landings, but seeks to maximize the cost in American lives by constructing defensive networks that exploit natural terrain features, that position mutually supporting weapons in depth, and that utilize underground tunnels and fortified positions capable of withstanding anything except a direct assault by infantry. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 reveals the full horror of this new reality. Marines armed with M1 and M2 flamethrowers, backpack-carried weapons that spray burning fuel at ranges of up to 40 yards, prove effective at clearing Japanese positions. But the men who wield these weapons die at rates that make the assignment nearly suicidal. The bright orange flame makes them unmistakable targets. The close range required for effectiveness exposes them to small arms fire from multiple positions. The weight and awkwardness of the equipment slows their movement. The life expectancy of a Marine flamethrower operator in combat is measured in minutes. and even when these men succeed in destroying their targets, the emotional and psychological cost proves devastating to the survivors. A colonel in the Chemical Warfare Service, watching the reports come in from Tarawa, recognizes that the problem requires not better flamethrowers, but different delivery systems. The weapon works, but the platform is unsuitable. What is needed is armor, mobility, greater fuel capacity, and the ability to project flame at longer ranges. The solution seems obvious: mount the flamethrower on a tank. But in the late months of 1943, as American industrial capacity focuses on producing Sherman tanks for the European theatre and landing craft for the ongoing Pacific campaigns, there is no spare production capacity for experimental variants. The colonel makes do with what is available: 24 obsolescent M3 light tanks, vehicles that have been superseded by better designs, but that can be modified for a new purpose. The work begins in workshops that operate on the principle that perfect is the enemy of good enough, that functional beats elegant, that the immediate needs of Marines dying on Pacific islands outweigh the methodical development processes favoured by ordnance departments operating in peacetime conditions. CBs, those construction battalions whose name derives from the initials CB and whose reputation for improvisation and resourcefulness has become legendary, take on the bulk of the modification work. They are electricians and machinists and welders, men who before the war repaired farm equipment and installed factory machinery and built bridges, and now they are drilling through armor plate and rerouting fuel lines and fabricating mounting brackets for equipment that does not yet have official technical specifications. By April 1944, they have produced a prototype. The M3 light tank they have modified carries 170 gallons of fuel mixture, more than twice the capacity of a backpack flamethrower, and can project flame at ranges of 60 to 80 yards. They name it Satan, a designation that conveys both its function and the unsettling effect it produces even in training demonstrations. All 24 Satan tanks see action at Saipan in June 1944, and the reports that come back justify every hour of improvised engineering. Marines who have been pinned down by Japanese positions call for the flame tanks with urgency that transcends standard tactical requests. When 200 Japanese soldiers fortify a cave with 2 openings, standard Sherman tanks and infantry units attempt to neutralize the position for hours without success. A single Satan tank approaches one opening while machine guns cover the other. The flame pours into the cave, and Japanese soldiers flee into the machine gun fire. 150 are killed, 50 surrender, a nearly unprecedented occurrence in a war where Japanese soldiers fight to the death with regularity that shocks even hardened American veterans. But the Satan tanks have limitations that become apparent in action. The fuel capacity, while an improvement over backpack units, proves insufficient for sustained operations. The range, adequate for many situations, falls short when dealing with positions on elevated terrain or deeply recessed into hillsides. The M3 light tank chassis, never designed for the kind of close assault work that flame tank operations demand, proves vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank weapons. The men working in the workshops on Oahu return to their engineering tables with a new set of specifications, this time calling for modification of M4 medium tanks, the Sherman, a platform that offers better armor protection, greater fuel capacity, and the psychological impact of a vehicle that Japanese gunners have learned to respect, if not quite fear. The development of what will become known as the POA CWS-H1, the official designation for the flame projector system that will see action on Iwo Jima, represents a convergence of lessons learned from multiple campaigns and the improvisational genius of men working under conditions that would paralyze more bureaucratic organizations. The flame gun is designed to fit inside the 75mm main gun tube, preserving the external appearance of a standard Sherman while allowing the vehicle to operate as a flame projector. The fuel capacity increases to 290 gallons, stored in tanks that replace the ammunition storage bins of a standard gun tank. The ignition system, a persistent source of problems in earlier designs, receives multiple redundant systems to ensure reliability under combat conditions. The range extends to 150 yards, providing standoff distance that reduces crew vulnerability to small arms fire. In November 1944, as plans for the invasion of Iwo Jima solidify in Fleet Headquarters, Marine commanders request 8 of the newly developed flame tanks on an urgent priority basis. The deadline is impossibly tight, 30 days from approval to delivery. The composite team of Seabees and chemical warfare personnel on Oahu accepts the challenge with the kind of confidence that emerges from men who have already accomplished what regulations said could not be done. They work in shifts that extend beyond 70 hours per week, not because they are ordered to, but because they understand with absolute clarity that every hour of delay translates to marine casualties on some future beach. Each tank requires 1,200 man-hours of labour. 1,100 electrical connections must be relocated. 150 pounds of welding rod per tank are consumed in the modification process. 150 parts per tank must be custom machined because no supply depot carries components for a weapon system that officially does not exist. On November 30th, 1944, the 8 flame tanks are delivered to the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, training for the invasion of Iwo Jima. The crews who will operate them begin familiarization training, learning the quirks of a system that combines the mechanical complexity of a Sherman tank with the additional challenges of nitrogen pressurization systems, fuel mixture ratios, and ignition sequences that must be executed with precision under conditions where mistakes result in catastrophic failure. They practice on ranges in Hawaii, where the volcanic terrain provides conditions roughly similar to what they will encounter on their target island, though none of them yet knows exactly where they are going or what they will face when they arrive. Iwo Jima measures 8 square miles, a speck of volcanic rock and ash located approximately 760 miles south of Tokyo. Its name translates as Sulphur Island, a reference to the deposits that give portions of the terrain a yellowish tint and produce a smell that will become inseparably associated with the battle in the memories of men who fight there. Before the war, it was home to a small civilian population engaged in sulphur mining and sugarcane production. By 1944, it has been transformed into something entirely different, a fortress whose defensive works represent the most sophisticated application of Japanese military engineering to emerge from the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrives on Iwo Jima in June 1944, dispatched by Imperial General Headquarters with orders to defend the island against the American invasion that everyone knows is coming. Kuribayashi is 53 years old, a career officer who has studied American industrial capacity and military methods, who has traveled in the United States before the war and developed a respect for American material superiority that has not endeared him to the more fanatical elements of the Japanese military hierarchy. He does not believe Iwo Jima can be held indefinitely. He does not believe that spiritual superiority can overcome firepower disparities of the magnitude that American forces can bring to bear. What he believes, and what he proceeds to implement with ruthless efficiency, is that the island can be made so costly to capture that the American public will lose its appetite for further advances toward the Japanese home islands. Kuribayashi's defense plan represents a radical departure from previous Japanese tactics. There will be no wasteful banzai charges, no suicidal attempts to throw American forces back into the sea. The beaches will be left largely undefended, allowing the Americans to land and concentrate their forces before Japanese artillery, silent during the pre-landing bombardment to avoid revealing positions, opens fire from concealed positions on the high ground overlooking the landing zones. The defensive network will be organized in depth with mutually supporting positions that allow Japanese forces to pour fire into American units from multiple angles. Most crucially, the entire defensive system will be built underground, with tunnels connecting pillboxes and bunkers and command posts, allowing Japanese forces to move between positions without exposing themselves to American observation, allowing them to survive bombardments that would obliterate surface structures, creating a defensive system that can be defeated only through close assault by infantry, the most costly form of warfare in terms of casualties. Over 8 months, Japanese forces dig 11 miles of tunnels through volcanic rock. They construct hundreds of pillboxes and bunkers, using reinforced concrete and positioning them to maximize overlapping fields of fire. They site artillery and mortar positions in caves and ravines where American forward observers cannot spot them. They camouflage machine gun positions so effectively that American forces will often not realize they are under fire from a bunker until casualties mount, and Marines triangulate firing positions through bitter experience. Kuribayashi stockpiles ammunition and supplies, calculating that the island must be made self-sufficient once American naval forces establish their blockade. He allows his subordinates 70% of their time for training and 30% for construction work, understanding that the effectiveness of his defences depends on the skill and discipline of the men who will operate them. By February 1945, when American forces begin their final preparations for the invasion, Iwo Jima has been transformed into what Marine planners will later describe as the most formidable defensive position encountered in the Pacific War. Kuribayashi commands approximately 21,000 men, a mix of Army and Navy personnel who have been indoctrinated with orders to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground. The Americans, reading reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports that cannot penetrate the tunnel networks hidden beneath the island's surface, believe that weeks of air raids and naval bombardment have significantly degraded Japanese defences. They plan for a battle lasting 5 days. They are wrong by a factor of more than 7. February 19, 1945, 0900 hours. The first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Divisions hits the beaches on the southeastern coast of Iwo Jima. The volcanic sand, composed of fine ash that provides no purchase for boots or hands, makes movement difficult from the moment the landing craft ramps drop. Marines struggle up terraces of loose material that collapses under their weight, carrying equipment loads that exceed 60 pounds per man, heading for objectives that sit on high ground to the north. For approximately an hour, Japanese forces hold their fire, following Kuribayashi's orders to allow the beaches to fill with men and equipment before commencing their defensive fires. When the Japanese guns open up, Marines die so quickly that unit cohesion dissolves into survival instinct. Machine gun fire from positions that seem to be firing from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously cuts down men who thought they had found cover. Mortar rounds, fired from positions inland where Japanese forward observers can see every square foot of the beach, land with precision that suggests they have been pre-registered for months, which they have. Artillery shells from positions in the island's interior add to the chaos, creating a killing zone that one war correspondent will describe as a nightmare in hell, a phrase that seems inadequate to the men experiencing it, but that will be repeated in countless accounts of the battle. The 8 flame tanks land on the first day, driven off landing craft onto beaches where disabled vehicles already create obstacles, and where the volcanic sand threatens to bog down anything heavier than a jeep. The tank crews, trained but untested in their specialized role, spend that first day simply trying to get their vehicles off the beach and into positions where they can be maintained and supplied. They do not yet understand that they represent the most valuable mobile assets in the entire invasion force, that Marine commanders will soon refuse to advance until flame tank support can be brought forward, that Japanese forces will come to fear them above all other American weapons. It is not until February 21st, day 3 of the battle, that the flame tanks enter action. The circumstances that lead to their employment reveal the desperation that has already gripped Marine commanders. Infantry units attempting to advance north from the landing beaches have been stopped by a network of pillboxes near Motoyama Airfield No. 1. Standard Shermans have fired high explosive shells at these positions without visible effect. Naval gunfire has been called in, adding to the cratered landscape, but failing to neutralize the Japanese guns. Casualties mount through the calculus of repeated failed assaults. Rifle companies that landed with 180 men are down to 60 effective fighters. The situation cannot be sustained. Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 21st Marines, makes the decision to call for flame tank support. He does not know what to expect. His briefing on the flame tanks consisted of a few sentences in the operations order, indicating that such assets were available upon request. Now, with his battalion pinned down and daylight burning away, he will gamble on a weapon system that none of his officers have seen in action. What happens over the next 6 hours alters the trajectory of the battle. Tank 431, Staff Sergeant Meza's vehicle, approaches the first Japanese pillbox from an oblique angle, using destroyed Japanese aircraft as concealment until the last possible moment. The first burst of flame pours through the firing slit in a stream that one witness will later compare to a liquid rope of fire. The pillbox, which has withstood direct hits from 75mm tank guns, is neutralized in 15 seconds. Marines watching from their positions in the volcanic ash understand immediately that they are witnessing something qualitatively different from any support weapon they have seen before. They begin to advance, using the flame tank as a moving shield, and 600 yards of ground that has cost over 100 casualties in the previous 2 days is taken in 6 hours, with casualties that are, by the standards of this battle, almost negligible. Word spreads through the Marine divisions with speed that would be impossible to replicate through official channels. Rifle company commanders contact battalion headquarters requesting flame tank support. Battalion commanders coordinate with tank battalion operations officers to ensure that flame tanks are positioned where they can be committed quickly when infantry encounters fortified positions. The 8 flame tanks, assets whose existence was classified information less than 3 months earlier, become the most requested support weapons on the island. The Japanese response evolves with a rapidity that demonstrates Kuribayashi's tactical flexibility. Anti-tank guns that had been targeting standard Shermans begin to focus on flame tanks, which can be identified by their infantry screens and their approach patterns that differ from gun-tank tactics. Japanese infantry units launch suicidal close assaults, attempting to approach flame tanks and disable them with demolition charges or magnetic mines. These attacks almost never succeed. The flame tanks supporting infantry and the psychological impact of the flame weapon itself prove too formidable, but they demonstrate the priority Japanese forces place on neutralizing these vehicles. Every major Japanese attack that targets American tank formations for the remainder of the battle includes flame tanks as primary objectives. February 23, 1945, the same day that the American flag is raised on Mount Suribachi in the photograph that will become the most iconic image of the Pacific War, Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams fights a 4-hour action that will earn him the Medal of Honor and illustrate the continuing need for man-portable flamethrowers even in an era when mechanized flame systems have proven their worth. Williams, a West Virginia farm boy who had to wait until the Marine Corps lowered its height requirements before he could enlist, operates with a standard M2 backpack flamethrower in terrain where tanks cannot maneuver. The pillboxes he encounters are positioned in broken ground where vehicular support cannot reach, and so he advances alone, except for 4 riflemen who provide covering fire, running back to Marine lines repeatedly to refuel his weapon and then returning to burn out one Japanese position after another. The action consumes 4 hours that Williams will later describe as largely blank in his memory, a fugue state of violence and terror and determination that leaves him with images he will carry for the rest of his life. When it is over, 7 pillboxes have been destroyed, and Williams has demonstrated that even with flame tanks available, there remain situations where only individual courage and a weapon that weighs 70 pounds can accomplish the mission. But Williams's action, while extraordinary in its heroism, is an exception that proves the larger rule. Where flame tanks can operate, they do so with an effectiveness that reduces Marine casualties by margins that would be difficult to believe if they were not documented in after-action reports from multiple units. Captain Frank Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines, will state unequivocally that, in his view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won the battle. The 4th Tank Battalion reports that the flamethrower was probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima. The 23rd Regimental Combat Team recommends that because of their great utility, more large flamethrower tanks should be provided. The 5th Tank Battalion advocates for a full company of flame tanks to be attached to each tank battalion, a force structure increase of roughly 40% in flame tank availability. These are not casual observations from officers seeking to justify resource allocations. They are assessments made by men who measured effectiveness in the lives of Marines they commanded, men who understand that recommendations for increased flame tank employment mean more men will go home at the end of the war. The daily operational routine of flame tank crews settles into patterns that combine extreme danger with mundane logistics. Each tank carries 290 gallons of fuel mixture, sufficient for roughly 40 to 60 bursts depending on duration and pressure settings. At Iwo Jima, flame tanks average 8 to 10,000 gallons of fuel consumption per day across the 8-vehicle fleet, meaning each tank must be refueled multiple times during any day of operations. Refueling requires removing the tank from the line, moving to a supply point where fuel trucks have been staged, and pumping fuel mixture into the interior tanks while crew members perform maintenance checks on ignition systems and pressure regulators and the 100 other components that can fail under combat conditions. The process requires 30 to 40 minutes per tank, time during which the vehicle is not available to support Marine infantry and during which crew members are vulnerable to Japanese artillery fire that lands on American positions with irregular but deadly persistence. Maintenance becomes a critical factor in sustained operations. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima infiltrates every mechanical system, abrading engine components and clogging air filters and wearing track pins at rates that exceed anything encountered in training. Transmission failures increase as tanks operate continuously on terrain that forces drivers to cycle through gear changes at frequencies that stress components beyond their design specifications. The flame projector system, with its network of fuel lines and nitrogen bottles and ignition circuits, requires constant monitoring. A CB electrician who operates a flame tank in combat for 20 days writes in a personal letter that he is using telephone wire for ignition circuits because spare parts have not arrived, an improvisation that would horrify safety inspectors but that keeps the weapon system operational when Marine infantry needs it. The psychological cost of flame tank operations begins to manifest in ways that will not be fully documented until years after the war ends. Corporal Thomas Carlson, the gunner in Tank 431, will testify in a post-war interview that you could hear them screaming when the flame hit, and that while the sounds did not last long, he heard them at night, and that decades later he still hears them. Maintenance crews find human remains fused to tank tracks, requiring blowtorches to remove. Tank crews report smells that penetrate even the diesel fumes and cordite smoke that pervade armoured vehicle operations. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the sulphur from volcanic rock, an odour that becomes so associated with flame tank operations that some crew members claim they can smell it years later in moments of stress or in dreams that replay combat experiences with hallucinogenic clarity. Yet the tanks continue to operate, continue to advance with Marine infantry, continue to pour flame into positions where Japanese soldiers have been ordered to fight to the death, and who do so with a discipline and courage that American forces, while they are its targets, cannot help but respect. In one documented incident, a Japanese officer charges a flame tank with a sword, alone, after the position he has been defending has been destroyed and his men killed. He covers 40 yards of open ground under machine gun fire from the tank's bull gun before he is cut down just feet from the vehicle, and the Marines who recover his sword later send it to Marine Corps headquarters, not as a trophy, but as a testament to an enemy who, however wrong his cause, demonstrated a form of bravery that transcended the horror of the battle. March 21, 1945, 30 days into a battle that was planned to last 5. The Japanese defensive line has contracted to a gorge in the northern portion of the island, a ravine where Kuribayashi has concentrated the remaining effective elements of his command. The terrain is impassable to standard armour operations, too steep and too broken for Sherman tanks to manoeuvre. Infantry assaults have been repulsed with casualties that approach the catastrophic, entire platoons decimated in attempts to advance through ground that allows Japanese gunners to fire from elevated positions into attackers who have no cover. Marine commanders face a choice between bypassing the position and declaring the island secure with approximately 800 Japanese soldiers still capable of resistance, or committing to a final assault that will certainly cost hundreds of additional American casualties. The flame tanks are committed in a final coordinated attack that consumes 8,000 gallons of fuel in a single day. The tanks approach from multiple angles, their infantry screens suppressing Japanese positions, while the flame projectors pour fire into cave mouths and bunker openings and ventilation shafts. Secondary explosions erupt as stored Japanese ammunition catches fire, the shock waves visible as pressure waves that disturb the volcanic dust coating every surface. By sunset, over 800 Japanese soldiers lie dead, many burned beyond recognition. Marine casualties for the day total 92 killed and 257 wounded, numbers that are horrifying in absolute terms, but that represent a fraction of what a conventional assault would have cost. Staff officers making calculations in battalion command posts understand that the flame tanks have, on this single day, saved between 300 and 500 American lives, lives that can be quantified and compared against projected casualty figures that assume conventional assault methods. But the men in the flame tanks understand costs that cannot be quantified in spreadsheets or after-action reports. Tank crews report severe psychological trauma from their role in what they describe, in the careful language of men trying to explain the unexplainable to people who were not present, as necessary slaughter. They did what they had to do, what the mission required, what their training prepared them for, but none of them will forget the smell or the sounds or the images visible through vision ports and periscopes. Some will refuse to discuss their experiences for decades. Others will speak with the kind of detachment that psychologists will later recognize as a defense mechanism, a way of processing memories too intense to confront directly. The Marine Corps, recognizing the unique stresses faced by flame tank crews, will eventually implement specialized debriefing protocols, but in March 1945 on Iwo Jima there is no time for such considerations. The battle continues until it ends, and the men who fight it must find their own ways to cope with what they have done and seen. March 26, 1945, 36 days after the invasion began. Iwo Jima is declared secure, a military term that means organized Japanese resistance has ceased, though small groups of Japanese soldiers will continue to hide in caves and tunnels for weeks, some emerging to surrender only after the war ends in August. The butcher's bill, the grim accounting that measures the cost of 8 square miles of volcanic rock, stuns even commanders hardened by years of war. American casualties total approximately 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. Japanese casualties exceed 18,000 killed, with only 216 taken prisoner, a ratio that illustrates the battle's ferocity and the effectiveness of Kuribayashi's defensive tactics. The flame tanks have survived the battle with losses that are, by the standards of armoured operations in this war, remarkably light. 2 of the 8 tanks have been disabled by mechanical failures that could not be repaired under combat conditions. 1 has suffered damage from a direct hit by Japanese artillery, though the crew survived. The remaining 5 are operational at the battle's end, still capable of pouring fire into positions that no longer exist, manned by crews who will now have 6 weeks to rest and refit before the next invasion, before Okinawa, before the planned assault on the Japanese home islands that will require every lesson learned at Iwo Jima to be applied on a scale that makes this battle look small by comparison. The lessons learned from Iwo Jima reshape American planning for subsequent operations. The request for flame tanks from units preparing for the Okinawa invasion increases to 54 vehicles, a 7-fold increase over the 8 committed to Iwo Jima. The 713th Tank Battalion is converted entirely to flame tank operations, its personnel sent to Hawaii to train with the Seabees, who have been producing flame tank conversions at a rate that now approaches industrial scale. By the time American forces land on Okinawa in April 1945, flame tanks are no longer experimental weapons, but standard components of the assault package, as integral to Marine Corps operations as artillery support or air cover. On Okinawa, flame tanks will compile a combat record that validates every modification, every hour of development work, every decision to prioritize their production over other weapon systems. The 713th Tank Battalion operates continuously for 85 days, from April 7 to June 30, 1945. The battalion is credited with killing 4,188 Japanese soldiers, while suffering 8 men killed or missing and 111 wounded, a kill ratio of 40-1 that would strain credulity if it were not documented in official records. The battalion's after-action report notes that flame tanks were used for flaming forward and reverse slopes of hills and escarpments, clearing foxholes and spider holes, attacking cliff caves and structural ruins, and that the hose extension system, which allows flame fuel to be projected around corners and into positions that cannot be engaged directly, proved valuable in situations where direct fire was impossible. The broader impact of flame tank development extends beyond casualty statistics and tactical effectiveness assessments. The story of how 8 tanks produced in makeshift workshops on Oahu came to play a decisive role in one of the war's bloodiest battles illustrates principles of innovation that will influence military development for decades to come. The flame tank program succeeded not through centralized planning and massive resource allocation, but through the initiative of small groups of technically skilled personnel who understood that problems have solutions if you are willing to improvise and iterate and accept that good enough today beats perfect next month. The Seabees who worked 75-hour weeks without being ordered to do so, who machined parts overnight because infantry needed them, who used telephone wire to repair ignition systems because proper spare parts had not arrived, embodied an approach to military innovation that bypassed bureaucratic procedures in favor of rapid prototyping and immediate deployment. This approach had costs that are less visible in official records. The flame tank development program operated with minimal safety protocols. One man was hospitalized for 16 days after being burned by acetylene gas while cutting armor plate, an incident that in a more regulated environment might have halted operations pending safety reviews. The crews who operated flame tanks in combat received minimal training on systems that were still being refined during the battles in which they were used. The psychological support structures that would later be recognized as essential for personnel operating in high-stress combat roles simply did not exist. These men succeeded not because the system supported them, but because they possessed the kind of resourcefulness and determination that cannot be created through training programs, but must emerge from individual character shaped by circumstances. The legacy of the Iwo Jima flame tanks extends through subsequent decades of American military operations. The M67 Zippo flame tank, deployed in Vietnam, represented a direct evolutionary descendant of the systems developed for Iwo Jima, incorporating lessons learned from Pacific combat into a platform designed for a different type of warfare. The psychological impact of flame weapons, both on their targets and on the personnel who operate them, became a subject of study that influenced decisions about weapon development and deployment. The recognition that certain tactical problems require specialized tools, that the cost of developing such tools can be justified by the lives they save, became embedded in military planning processes. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is embodied in the testimony of men like Captain Frank Caldwell, who stated without qualification that flame tanks, more than any other supporting arm, won the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is not the language of hyperbole or post-war myth-making. It is the assessment of an officer who watched Marines die, who made decisions that sent men forward into killing zones, who measured effectiveness in the cold arithmetic of casualties avoided. When such men say that a weapon was decisive, they are speaking from experience that cannot be challenged by historians or theorists operating with the luxury of hindsight and distance. February 21, 1945, 14:25 hours, 5 minutes after Staff Sergeant Meza's tank poured its first burst of flame into a Japanese pillbox near Motoyama Airfield. The Marines who had been pinned down by machine gun fire are advancing now, moving through volcanic ash toward positions that 5 minutes earlier seemed impregnable. They do not know that they are witnessing the tactical application of a weapon system that has been developed over 18 months through the collaborative effort of Navy Seabees, Chemical Warfare Service personnel, and Marine Corps officers operating in workshops thousands of miles away. They do not know that the 8 tanks supporting their advance represent the total inventory of such weapons in the Pacific Theatre. They do not know that military historians will later identify this moment as a turning point in the battle, the first large-scale employment of a weapon that will be credited with saving thousands of American lives. What they know is simpler and more immediate. They know that positions which had resisted every other weapon in the American arsenal are burning now, their defenders dead or fleeing or surrendering. They know that they are advancing when 5 minutes ago advancement seemed impossible. They know that the tank ahead of them, indistinguishable in external appearance from any other Sherman except for the way infantry clusters around it like steel protecting the most valuable asset on the battlefield, represents something new and terrible and necessary. They will tell stories about this tank and the others like it, stories that will be repeated in rest areas behind the lines and in field hospitals where wounded men compare experiences, stories that will make flame tanks the most requested support weapon in the Marine Corps inventory. The battle for Iwo Jima will continue for 34 more days. It will consume lives at rates that shock even commanders who have led men through previous Pacific campaigns. It will produce acts of heroism so commonplace that Medal of Honor actions occur with frequency that would be impossible to properly recognize if the standards were not so high, if the bar for extraordinary courage were not set at levels that require witnesses to verify that yes, this man really did advance alone against fortified positions, really did continue fighting after being wounded, really did sacrifice himself to save others. The battle will enter American consciousness through Joe Rosenthal's photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, an image that will be reproduced millions of times and will become synonymous with American determination and sacrifice. But for the men who fought on the ground, who measured progress in yards gained and friends lost, who understood that every objective taken came at a price calculated in lives and suffering, the image that endures is often not the flag raising, but the sight of a Sherman tank moving forward with flame pouring from its gun tube, burning away positions that could not be destroyed by any other means, making possible advances that would otherwise have cost casualties that even in a war of mass armies could not be sustained. These men, Marines and soldiers, who will go home when the war ends and who will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people who were not there what it was like, will speak of flame tanks with a mixture of gratitude and horror, recognition of a weapon that saved their lives and knowledge of what that weapon did to men who were also someone's sons and brothers. The flame tanks themselves, the 8 vehicles that fought at Iwo Jima and survived, will have varied fates. Some will be refurbished and sent to Okinawa for the next invasion. Others will remain on Iwo Jima as the island is converted from battlefield to airbase, relegated to maintenance yards until they can be shipped to rear areas. Eventually, most will be scrapped, their useful service lives ended, their components recycled into other vehicles or other purposes. The flame projector systems will be removed and studied, their designs refined for the next generation of weapons. None will be preserved as museum pieces, at least not initially, because in 1945 there is too much war left to fight and too many needs to be met for sentiment to govern decisions about resource allocation. Decades later, when military museums begin collecting artifacts from the Pacific War, and veterans groups start advocating for preservation of vehicles that represent technological innovations, efforts will be made to reconstruct examples of the Iwo Jima flame tanks. But the originals, the 8 Shermans that were modified by Seabees in workshops on Oahu and that burned Japanese positions on volcanic sand, will be gone, consumed by the same war that gave them purpose. What remains is the record of their employment, documented in after-action reports and casualty figures, and the testimony of men who watched them work, evidence that innovation driven by immediate necessity and implemented by skilled personnel willing to work beyond regulation can produce results that alter the course of battles and save lives in quantities that justify every hour of development and every risk taken in rushing untested systems into combat. The story of the flamethrower tanks on Iwo Jima is not ultimately about technology, though the engineering achievements involved were considerable. It is not about tactics, though the employment of these weapons demonstrated tactical innovations that would influence military doctrine for generations. It is about the intersection of desperate need and human ingenuity, about what happens when competent people are given a problem and the freedom to solve it, without waiting for perfect solutions or complete data or approval from higher echelons that may not understand the urgency of conditions at the front. It is about Marines who died at rates that shocked a nation, and about the weapons that, introduced at the moment when the battle seemed likely to consume entire divisions, changed the calculus of cost and made victory possible at a price that, while still terrible, was less than what would otherwise have been paid. February 21st, 1945, 14:30 hours, 10 minutes after the first burst of flame from Tank 431. Staff Sergeant Robert Meza sits in his commander's position, monitoring pressure gauges and watching through vision ports as Marines advance past his position toward objectives that are now accessible because the machine guns that dominated this ground are silent. He does not think about the men who died in the pillbox his tank just destroyed. He cannot afford to think about that, not now, not while the battle continues and Marines are counting on him to keep the tank operational and the flame projector ready for the next target. Later, perhaps, after the battle ends and there is time to process what has happened, he will think about it. He will have a lifetime to think about it. But now, in this moment, he has a job to do, and he does it with the professional competence of a man who understands that other people's lives depend on his skill and his nerve and his ability to function under conditions that would paralyze anyone who stopped to consider the full implications of what they are doing. Behind him, 7 more flame tanks are maneuvering into positions where they can support Marine advances against other Japanese positions, other pillboxes that contain other men who have been ordered to fight to the death and who will do so because they understand duty in terms that transcend survival. The battle will be decided not by which side is more courageous. Both sides have demonstrated courage beyond anything that should be asked of men, but by which side possesses the tools that allow courage to be translated into tactical success. On this day, in this battle, on this island that will be remembered as one of the bloodiest battlefields in American military history, that tool is a modified Sherman tank carrying 290 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel, and a crew willing to close to ranges where they can see the results of what they are doing, where they can hear and smell and witness the effects of a weapon that will haunt some of them for the rest of their lives. But that will allow thousands of other men to have lives to be haunted by, to go home, to survive a war that consumes lives with industrial efficiency. The sun sets over Iwo Jima on the evening of February 21st, 1945, painting the volcanic ash in shades of red and orange that seem appropriate to an island where so much blood has been spilled and where flame has become the weapon that makes advancement possible. The 8 flame tanks that have operated this day have consumed approximately 2,000 gallons of fuel mixture among them, destroyed or neutralized dozens of Japanese positions, and supported Marine advances that would have been impossible or impossibly costly without their presence. Tomorrow they will refuel and conduct maintenance checks and move forward with Marine infantry as the battle continues its grinding progress toward the island's northern end. They will operate every day until the battle ends, pouring fire into defensive positions that have been prepared by engineers who understood their craft and defended by soldiers who understood their duty. In workshops on Oahu, thousands of miles away, Seabees are already at work on the next batch of flame tanks, the 54 vehicles requested for the Okinawa invasion. They work with the confidence of men who know their products work, who have received reports from Iwo Jima that validate every modification and every hour of development time. They also work with the knowledge that comes from reading casualty lists, understanding that every flame tank they produce represents marine lives saved, a calculus that gives meaning to their labor beyond any formal recognition or official commendation. The flame tanks of Iwo Jima represent a story that could only have happened in the context of World War II, when the urgency of combat and the scale of industrial mobilization created conditions where improvisation was not just accepted but required, where men with technical skills were given problems and told to solve them by whatever means necessary, where the distance between concept and battlefield deployment could be measured in weeks rather than years. The weapon systems they created were not elegant or sophisticated by the standards of modern military technology. They were functional and brutal and effective, designed to solve a specific problem under specific conditions by men who understood that perfect was the enemy of good enough, and that Marines dying on beaches could not wait for the next development cycle. The legacy of those tanks, conceived in workshops by men who understood that necessity does not wait for perfection, lives on not in museums or monuments, but in the thousands of men who returned home from Iwo Jima because a weapon existed that could neutralize positions that would otherwise have required suicidal frontal assaults. In the calculus of war, where value is measured in lives saved and objectives achieved, the 8 flame tanks that fought on Iwo Jima represent one of the most successful, rapid development programs in military history. A weapon system that went from concept to combat effectiveness in 18 months, and that, according to multiple commanders who witnessed its employment, was the decisive factor in winning the battle. The men who crewed those tanks carried their experiences forward into peacetime lives that bore little resemblance to the 36 days they spent on volcanic sand. Some spoke openly about their service, appearing at reunions and veterans events, answering questions from younger generations who could not imagine the conditions under which these weapons were employed. Others maintained silence, finding that the distance between their combat experiences and civilian life was too vast to bridge through words, that explaining what it felt like to pour fire into positions containing human beings required a shared context that most listeners simply did not possess. Both responses were valid. Both represented ways of coping with memories that were simultaneously sources of pride and profound psychological burden. Staff Sergeant Robert Meza returned to civilian life in 1946, took a job as a machinist in a factory that produced agricultural equipment, married, raised 3 children, and lived until 1998 without ever speaking publicly about his role as commander of Flame Tank 431. His family discovered his combat record only after his death, when they found a box of documents that included his Silver Star citation and a letter from a Marine captain thanking him for actions that saved the lives of men under the captain's command. The family donated the documents to the Marine Corps Museum, where they remain in archives accessed primarily by researchers studying the technological evolution of armored warfare. The tactical and strategic lessons learned from flame tank employment on Iwo Jima influenced American military doctrine for decades. The recognition that certain defensive positions could be defeated only through specialized weapons led to continued development of flame systems through the Korean War and into Vietnam, where the M67 Zippo flame tank, a direct descendant of the Iwo Jima vehicles, operated in conditions vastly different from Pacific Island warfare, but with effectiveness that validated the basic concept. The Vietnamese jungle, dense and concealing, proved as vulnerable to flame as volcanic bunkers, and Viet Cong positions that could resist conventional weapons often collapsed when confronted with fire that consumed oxygen and filled enclosed spaces with superheated gases. But the evolution of warfare eventually rendered obsolete the close assault flame tank that proved so decisive on Iwo Jima. The development of improved anti-tank weapons, particularly those employing shaped-charge warheads capable of penetrating armor at ranges exceeding the effective distance of flame projectors, meant that flame tanks could be destroyed before they could employ their primary weapon. The introduction of thermobaric weapons and fuel-air explosives, delivered by artillery or aircraft, and capable of producing effects similar to flame weapons but at greater ranges and with less risk to friendly forces, provided alternative means of defeating fortified positions. By the 1990s, dedicated flame tanks had largely disappeared from the inventories of modern militaries, replaced by weapon systems that could achieve similar effects through different means. The ethical dimensions of flame weapons, always present but subordinated to military necessity during World War II, emerged as increasingly prominent concerns in the post-war period. The United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980 and entering into force in 1983, restricted the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations and in forests, recognizing that such weapons cause suffering disproportionate to their military utility in many circumstances. The protocol did not ban flame weapons entirely, acknowledging their legitimate role in destroying military fortifications and equipment, but the restrictions and the changing nature of warfare combined to accelerate the decline of flame tank development. The weapon that saved thousands of American lives on Iwo Jima came to be seen, in peacetime reflection, as a tool whose horror could be justified only by the extremity of the circumstances that demanded its use. The men who fought on Iwo Jima, both those who operated flame tanks and those who benefited from their support, carried forward into American culture a complex legacy that resists simple interpretation. They fought in a war that was existentially necessary against an enemy whose tactics and ideology demanded a level of violence that shocked even veterans of the European theatre. They employed weapons that were terrifying in their effects, but that demonstrably reduced casualties among their own forces. They witnessed and participated in acts that haunted them for decades, but that they understood, even in their darkest moments of remembrance, to have been necessary given the alternatives. This complexity, this refusal to fit neatly into categories of triumph or trauma, represents perhaps the most honest accounting of what war demands and what it costs, even when it is won. February 21st, 1945, 14:35 hours, 15 minutes after Staff Sergeant Meeser's flame tank poured its first burst into a Japanese pillbox, 5 minutes after the Marines began their advance, the same moment that opened this account, but seen now with the knowledge of what will follow, what these tanks will accomplish, what costs they will impose, and what casualties they will prevent. The volcanic ash still clings to everything. The sulfur smell still pervades the air. The sound of small arms fire still echoes across terrain that offers no shelter and no escape. But the machine gun that dominated this ground is silent now, its crew dead in ways that would be horrifying to contemplate if contemplation were possible in the midst of battle. The Marines are moving forward, taking ground that 5 minutes ago seemed permanently denied to them, advancing toward objectives that will require weeks more of fighting, but that have become, in this moment, achievable rather than theoretical. Meeser does not know, cannot know in this moment, that historians will identify his tank's action as a turning point, that the weapon system he operates will be credited with saving thousands of American lives, that the modifications performed by Seabees in Hawaiian workshops will influence military technology for decades. He knows only that the mission is accomplished, that Marines are advancing, that his crew is intact, and his tank operational. In 6 hours, he will refuel and perform maintenance checks. Tomorrow, he will do it again. For 34 more days, he will operate this tank, pouring fire into positions designed by skilled engineers and defended by determined soldiers, until the island is secured and the battle ends, and he can begin the long process of trying to forget what he has done and seen and heard. He will never entirely succeed in forgetting, none of them will, but he will live a long life and raise a family and contribute to his community and die peacefully, which is more than can be said for the thousands of young men, American and Japanese, who died on this island in a battle that consumed lives at rates that shocked even a world grown accustomed to industrial-scale warfare. The 8 flame tanks that fought on Iwo Jima were tools, instruments designed for a specific purpose, and employed under conditions that demanded maximum effectiveness regardless of cost. But they were operated by men, Americans whose names are recorded in unit rosters and service records, but whose experiences largely vanished with them, Japanese defenders whose names are often unknown, but whose courage and sacrifice deserve recognition even as we acknowledge the cause for which they fought was unjust. The story of these tanks is ultimately inseparable from the story of these men, from the Seabees who built them working shifts that exceeded any reasonable expectation, from the tank crews who operated them, knowing that their weapon made them priority targets, from the Marine infantry who advanced behind them, grateful for support that made survival possible, from the Japanese soldiers who died in positions their commanders told them to hold to the last man, and who did so with discipline that transcended the individual will to survive. Wars end. Battles are won and lost. Weapons become obsolete and are replaced by more sophisticated systems that in turn become obsolete. But the record remains, preserved in after-action reports and casualty statistics and the testimony of men who were present, and that record reveals that in the winter and spring of 1945, on an island that measures 8 square miles and that cost approximately 50,000 casualties to capture, a weapon system developed through improvisation and necessity and implemented by skilled personnel willing to work beyond regulation proved decisive in ways that altered the outcome of the battle. The flame tanks of Iwo Jima represent a convergence of desperation and ingenuity, of tactical necessity and engineering skill, of individual courage and collective effort, a story that could only have emerged from the specific conditions of the Pacific War, but that carries lessons about innovation and adaptation that transcend any single conflict. 70 years after the battle, when the last survivors are elderly men whose memories have been shaped by decades of remembering and forgetting and reconstructing, when the island itself has been returned to Japan and transformed from battlefield to memorial, when the flame tanks that fought there have been scrapped or lost or exist only as technical specifications in military archives, the story persists. It persists in the families of men who returned home because a weapon existed that could neutralize positions that would otherwise have required suicidal assaults. It persists in military institutions that study the battle as a case study in combined arms operations and the importance of specialized weapons for specific tactical problems. It persists in the broader American consciousness as one element in a battle that represents both the horror of war and the determination required to win it. The flame tanks of Iwo Jima were never elegant weapons. They were brutal and functional, and designed to solve a problem that had no clean solution, that required closing with an enemy who had prepared his defenses with skill and determination, and who had been ordered to fight to the death. They worked, which in the context of war is the only criterion that ultimately matters, and they saved lives even as they took them in ways that horrified even the men who operated them. This duality, this simultaneous pride in effectiveness and horror at method, represents the fundamental moral complexity of warfare, the recognition that even necessary violence carries costs that cannot be fully calculated or justified through appeals to strategic necessity. February 24, 1945, 40 hours, 20 minutes after the first flame burst, and the battle continues as it will continue for 34 more days. Staff Sergeant Meza's tank moves forward, following Marines who advance behind the steel shelter it provides, heading toward the next objective, where another Japanese position waits with machine guns and mortars and soldiers who have been told they are defending the approaches to the homeland itself. The tank's fuel gauge shows 800 gallons remaining, enough for 20 more extended bursts, enough to neutralize 20 more positions, enough to allow Marines to advance perhaps another 1,000 yards before the inevitable refueling halt. Tomorrow there will be more objectives, more Japanese positions, more desperate fighting across terrain that offers no natural advantage to the attacker. But tomorrow is irrelevant to men living minute to minute, measuring survival by the distance to the next cover and the accuracy of the next enemy burst. They have this moment, this advance, this ground taken at a cost that is acceptable only because the alternative costs were worse. And somewhere in workshops on Oahu, 5,000 miles away from volcanic sand and sulfur smell and the sound of men dying, Seabees are assembling flame tank number 54, the last vehicle in the production run for Okinawa. where the lessons of Iwo Jima will be applied on a larger scale against defences that make even Kuribayashi's fortifications look modest by comparison. These men work with the knowledge that their products save lives, that every hour they spend welding and fitting and testing translates to Marines who will return home rather than dying on beaches whose names they cannot yet pronounce. It is work that gives meaning beyond paychecks and duty rosters, work that connects them directly to outcomes, even though they will never see the battles where their creations are employed. They work through the night, and when the sun rises over Pearl Harbor, they will still be working, because there is a war to be won, and men to be saved, and tanks to be built, and because in this moment in 1945, those imperatives override every other consideration. The story of the flamethrower tanks on Iwo Jima is a story of innovation born from desperation, of improvisation that became doctrine, of weapons that terrified even those who wielded them, but that saved lives in quantities that justified their employment. It is a story that resists simplification, that cannot be reduced to heroes and villains or triumph and tragedy without losing essential truth. It is a story of men who did terrible necessary things, and who lived with the consequences, who understood that war demands choices between bad options and worse ones, who made those choices and carried forward the knowledge of what they had done. It is, finally, a story that deserves to be remembered, not because it provides comfortable lessons or validates preconceptions about warfare, but because it reveals the reality of combat in its full complexity, horror, necessity, and aftermath. The flame tanks are gone, scrapped decades ago, but their legacy persists in the lives they saved and the men who operated them, and the recognition that sometimes the only path to victory requires weapons and tactics that extract psychological costs from those who employ them, even as they reduce casualties among the forces they support. That is the story of Iwo Jima's flame tanks, told not to glorify war, but to honor the men who fought it, and to remember what was required of them in a battle that consumed lives at rates that shocked even a world grown accustomed to mechanized slaughter. They did what they were asked to do, and thousands of men came home because of it. And that is the only justification that matters, and the only one that can never be entirely sufficient.